Welcome everyone to BMRC's Fall Fellow Speaker Series. Today we have Sophia Sanzo-Davis. Sophia was a BMRC 2025 Summer Research Fellow, and today she will be speaking about her research on the legacy of Margaret Burroughs' Black archival and cultural stewardship practices on Chicago's South Side. Sophia Sanzo-Davis is a cultural worker from the San Francisco Bay Area. She graduated with honors from UC Berkeley in 2021 with a BA in African American Studies and a minor in Public Policy. Since graduating, Sophia has worked in community engagement at the Brooklyn Museum, where she managed institutional programs, including the launch of the inaugural Museums on Wheels project, a mobile extension of the museum that brings art-based programming across the borough. Her research interests include Black archival studies, institutional cultural stewardship, segregation and gentrification, sites of memory, and Black visual culture. Sophia is also a second-year PhD student at UC Berkeley in the Africana Studies program. Before we turn the screen or floor over to Sophia, I'd like to just say a little bit about the BMRC for those who are new to us. The BMRC is a network of 28 archives, libraries, and museums, and we seek to cultivate and steward a network of all who want to document, share, and understand and preserve Black experiences in the Chicago area. You can see here the list of our members, which continues to grow. And our summer short-term Fellows project has been something that the BMRC has done since 2009. To date, we've given more than 130 fellowships to scholars. Here you see some of our 2025 cohort. More than 30 books have been published, fiction as well as nonfiction, poetry, plays. And so the reach of the research and the work goes far beyond the summer fellowship. Here's just a display of some of the books that have been published from our researchers. Next summer, we will actually not have the Summer Research Fellowship because it'll be our 20th anniversary and we will have the Anniversary Symposium on Black Chicago. So we invite anyone who might be doing research relevant to the history of Black Chicago to look at the call for papers on our website and consider submitting an abstract by January 5th. And we also invite you to support the BMRC's initiatives. Your funding goes to support things like our fellows. It's a very tangible way you can help this work continue. And our next talk, because we still have two more, one in December, I think the next might have to wait until the new year, we have a talk with Dr. Brander Alston from The Ohio State University. So now, without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our soon-to-be Dr. Sophia Sanzo-Davis.
Thank you, Samaya. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today and to talk a little bit about my experience in the Margaret Burroughs papers this summer. I'm currently a second-year PhD student in UC Berkeley's African Diaspora and African American Studies department, where I am focusing on Black visual culture more broadly and the possibility for a Black archival practice as an alternative means of collecting and preservation. So with that being said, welcome to my presentation, A Framework for Future Preservation, the Legacy of Margaret Taylor Burroughs's Black Archival and Cultural Stewardship Practices in Chicago's South Side. This presentation follows my month spent in the Margaret Burroughs papers at the DeSable Museum this summer. While this brief presentation will not be a complete overview of Dr. Burroughs's life and impact in Chicago's South Side, I think there could be an entire class built around that topic, honestly. It will work to situate her practices as an artist and educator within the larger dialogue of museum practice and responsibility, especially as it relates to Black people in the South Side and the United States more broadly. Before I get started on my findings, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I came to this topic. As someone from the San Francisco Bay Area, I was embarrassingly unaware of Dr. Burroughs until a few years ago. Um, After having spent the previous few years working in museums, I became interested in this concept of Black archival practice, of which I'll talk more about later on in the presentation. I hadn't been admitted to grad school yet, and it was really just a floating idea I had in the notes of my phone titled Research Ideas. I was lucky enough to go on a Dilla tour of Bronzeville when I visited some family in Chicago a few years ago, and on this tour, Dilla mentioned Dr. Burroughs. Although it was only a few words on her work at the Southside Community Arts Center and the DuSable Museum, I went immediately to my notes and wrote down her name in the hopes that I would be able to learn more about her and her practices as I work toward a dissertation project. One final note before we fully get into it, I'd like to thank the Black Metropolis Research Consortium for accepting my proposal this year, as well as the DuSable Museum's archives team, especially Julie Ashley, for their support this summer as I worked through their archive. So, Dr. Burroughs was the true definition of a multi-hyphenate. She was a founder of the Southside Community Arts Center and the DuSable Museum, formerly the Ebony Museum. She was an educator, an artist, a poet and writer, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, among many other titles. As you'll see today, all of these roles become apparent in her practice as an educator, artist, and collector. I'd like to start with a poem by Dr. Burroughs, which I think speaks to the crux of her interests among these intersecting practices and identities. Those of you who are familiar with Dr. Burroughs probably know this work, but I think its grounding by Dr. Burroughs herself will be a good place for me to start. The poem titled "What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black? Reflections of an African American Mother" is arguably one of her most well-known and, as stated by her, lends itself to an understanding of the creation of the DuSable Museum and her broader relationship to the South Side of Chicago.
Literary part of your talent.
Yeah, I guess so.
I'm serious. It is. Go right ahead.
Professor Dixon, which is really I think this poem embodies the origin of the DuSable Museum.
Okay.
And it's called "What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black?"
Okay.
And the subtitle is "Reflections of an African American Mother."
Absolutely.
This one was written in 1963 on occasion of the 100th anniversary of the emancipation of our people, 1863, 1963.
Yes.
What shall I tell my children who are Black of what it means to be a captive in this dark skin? What shall I tell my dear ones, fruit of my womb, of how beautiful they are when everywhere they turn, they are faced with abhorrence of everything that is Black? Villains are Black with black hearts. A black cow gives no milk. A black hen lays no eggs. Bad news comes bordered in black. Black is evil, they say, and evil is Black, and devil's food is Black. All that is bad is Black. What shall I tell my dear ones who've been raised in a white world? A place where white has been made to represent all that is good and pure and fine and decent, where clouds are white and dolls and heaven. Heaven surely is a white, white place filled with angels robed in white, and cotton candy and ice cream and milk and ruffled Sunday dresses and dream houses and long, sleek Cadillacs. And angels' food is white. All that is good is white. What can I say, therefore, when my Black child comes home to me in tears because a playmate identical to himself has called him Black, big lip, flat nose, and nappy headed? What will he think when I dry his tears and whisper, yes, that is true, but you are no less beautiful and dear? How shall I lift up his head and get him to square his shoulders, to look his adversaries in the eye, confident in the knowledge of his worth, serene under his sable skin and proud of his own beauty? What can I do to give him the strength that he may come through life's adversities as a whole human being, unwarped and human in a world that is full of biased laws and inhuman practices? That he might survive, and survive he must. For who knows? Perhaps this Black child of mine here bears the genius to discover the cure for cancer, or the brilliance to chart the course for the exploration of the universe. So he must survive for the good of all humanity. He must and will survive. I have drunk deeply of late from the fountain of my Black culture. I have sat at the knee of and learned from Mother Africa. I have discovered the truth of my heritage, the truth so often obscured and omitted, and I find I have much to say to all of my Black children. I will lift up their heads of proud Blackness and tell them the story of their fathers and their fathers' fathers. And I shall take them into a way back time of kings and queens who ruled the Nile, who raised the pyramids, who measured the stars, who discovered the laws of music and mathematics. I will tell them of a Black people, our Black people, upon whose backs have been built the wealth of 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and America. And I will tell them this and more, Knowledge of his heritage shall be his weapon and his armor. It will make him strong enough to win any battle he may face. And since this story is so often obscured and omitted, I must sacrifice to find it for my children, even as I sacrifice to feed, clothe, and shelter them. This I will do for them. If I love them, nobody else will do it for me. I must find the truth of heritage for myself and pass it on to them. And in years to come, I believe, because I have armed them with the truth, my children and their children's children will venerate me, for it is the truth that will make us free.
What shall I tell my children about?
I ground us in Dr. Burroughs' poetry, not only to bring her voice into the room, but also to bring our attention to the stakes of this work for Dr. Burroughs. The work of educating and protecting Black children in a world built off anti-Black violence is really a matter of life and death. Dr. Burroughs encourages us to think of a possibility in which our Black children are able to make way in a world that thrives off their negation. Dr. Burroughs' creation and work with arts and educational institutions on the South Side is fueled by this inquiry she negotiates in her poetry and can be found across many documents in the archive. This work, featured here, titled Mother and Child, is a line-a-cut print, a favorite medium of Burroughs, which she used frequently in her educational materials for the museum and in arts education. The image features a child whose gaze meets that of the viewers in an embrace with their mother. The mother looks in admiration of her young one. The child who holds their gaze outward requires us to do more than look at her, but to see her. We can see the stampings made possible by the gentle and repetitive carvings hand-scraped by Dr. Burroughs. The mother and her child would blend into each other if it wasn't for the floral-like pattern on the child's dress. Upon seeing this image, we might feel the warm embrace of a mother, but Burroughs is also telling us to see Black children, to look at them as deserving of the dreams in which their mother might be thinking of at that exact moment. In many ways, this is representative of the mission of the DeSable Museum, to quote from one of their institutional papers. Inspire Black people, and especially the youth, into purposeful lives of achievement by acquainting them with the contributions of great Negro Americans of the past and bringing to their attention the worthwhile contributions of the Negro person to American and world culture. With this framing of Dr. Burroughs' interest in doing this work for future generations, I'd like to ground us in some theoretical work which further situates my archival findings. Ultimately, my theoretical interest in the impossibilities of the museum lie in this question of Black archival practice. In the essay, A Relationship to Evidence of Black Life, featured in an issue of the Black Scholar, Amaka Okechukwu from the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York, describes Black archival practice as, quote, beyond the professional work of describing, arranging, and cataloging materials about Black existence or by Black people. Rather, it is about an ethic of care and recovery that exceeds the boundaries of formal archives and archiving, and because of this, sometimes looks like research, curating, storytelling, and art making, and is nurtured collectively. Black archival practice is a relationship to evidence that recognizes Black humanity and complexity. It is concerned with history, memory, and community vitality. They go further to say that this type of memory work, quote, goes beyond the professional boundaries of archiving and ultimately leads to a community claiming a history of survival and resistance to oppression, and the subsistence of a community persistence. I see Dr. Burroughs as a progenitor of Black archival practice and use Okechukwu's definition of the practice as a starting point for understanding how a Black institution comes to support its future through preservation and engagement with the past. By taking a multifaceted approach to programming, education, and collecting, Dr. Burroughs was able to create a museum and archival institution that spoke to the community in which it sat. As you'll see in the slides to come, Dr. Burroughs and her collaborators, such as her husband, Charles Burroughs, and co-founder Eugene Feldman, wished to do more than simply collect materials, but also to develop works that brought awareness of Black history to visitors and students. They saw it as their societal mission to implore people to take the archival efforts of the African American community seriously and as an active site for education and engagement. An additional sort of theoretical framing I'd like to talk about is the museum as an extension of her kitchen table. In my general research on Dr. Burroughs, I read Southside Venus, The Legacy of Margaret Burroughs by Marianne Kane. In this exploration of Dr. Burroughs' life and legacy, Kane spoke of the, quote, universal sphere that resided in the Burroughs' home and original museum. During one moment in particular, she references Feldman, who noted the centrality of the kitchen table as a setting for communion and debate. For Feldman and others, the kitchen table became a place of, quote, serious exchange, but also lively spirits, featuring folks who were academics in the traditional sense and folks who were self-educated. I see the museum in all its forms doing the work of the kitchen table. Citing the work as a type of human relations, the site of the museum became a space for folks of all educational and cultural and racial backgrounds to gather, observe, discuss, and participate in programming that supported the persistence of Black legacy work. I see the kitchen table as a site within the type of Black archival practice Burroughs is implementing as part of her praxis. The kitchen table, once moved into abstraction, becomes the site for three prongs, which I see as being central to the makeup of the museum's core interests as a collecting and exhibiting institution. As I looked through all of my notes during my visit, it became apparent to me that Dr. Burroughs and her team developed a museum and archival practice rooted in three categories: education, cross-cultural collaboration, and collective and active preservation. Throughout the remainder of this presentation, I will explore how these prongs appear in the Margaret Burroughs papers and are indicative of the framework of the DuSable Museum in its current and historic iterations. The Margaret Burroughs papers were riddled with educational materials and memos referencing the advancement of education goals and programming and relationships with schools and prisons. In my finding, it was common to see pamphlets or guidebooks written by Eugene Feldman, an integral member of the DuSable team who took on much of the education materials. In addition to Feldman's writings, the pamphlets would often feature illustrations by Margaret Burroughs. These educational resources would address histories perhaps not touched on in the public school canon and also became an opportunity for a small amount of revenue, as indicated by the 50-cent price tag at the top of the Negro History Educational Materials Bulletin. In addition to creating the source material, multiple letters in the papers also indicated educators' interest in using the DuSable Museum as a resource. In fact, many white teachers reached out to Feldman and Burroughs, seeking materials so they could adequately teach their Black students. This can be seen in letters such as what's pictured here when a teacher from the Harvey, Illinois public school system reaches out because of an interest in teaching Black students as a white teacher. This commitment to supporting integrated learning environments was made even more apparent when Dr. Burroughs wrote a general letter calling for the integration of teaching materials. Dr. Burroughs noted that integration was more than the act of integrating bodies into schools, but teaching across racial and cultural lines. While I'm interested in the overall calls for integration in this general letter by Burroughs, I am also interested in what it means for her to call out this system as one that upholds the philosophy of white supremacy. So while she was someone who very clearly knew how to toe the line by being in correspondence with white politicians and supporting the education of white children in Black history, she was not afraid to bring to light the sort of violence that persists in the consistent non-engagement with Black history and culture in the U.S. school systems. Feldman and Burroughs were also in active communication with students and teachers, offering their services outside the walls of the museum. In a letter to a student from Skokie, Burroughs describes the educational offerings that travel to schools in the area. This type of museum education practice brings objects to the students, removing one additional barrier to entry into understanding Black history and culture. The specific program that she mentioned was an early program titled The African Experience, where she would bring musical instruments and garb to get Black children to connect to a Black history that was a part of the larger diaspora. In addition to schools, Dr. Burroughs was also deeply committed to being in correspondence with incarcerated members of the community and hosted an onslaught of arts education programs that supported rehabilitation efforts. Margaret Burroughs' archive was filled with correspondence, flyers, meeting minutes, and newsletters that outlined an institutional commitment to education across racial lines, carceral status, and class status. These educational endeavors would not have been possible without the collaborative nature of the institution. Upon entering the archive, my initial focus was, of course, on Dr. Burroughs, and in many ways still is, but really at the center of the success of the DuSable Museum is the many people that collaborated to contribute to its educational, programmatic, and archival goals. Her vision for the institution was only made possible through engagement with those around her and reliance on partners across racial lines. One could not ignore the profound impact of Eugene Feldman, a white Jewish man from the South who saw Black history as pertinent information to spread. His name is all over pamphlets and letters to teachers and the public. He was truly dedicated to the type of Black archival practice that was underway at the museum. He often wrote pamphlets that Dr. Burroughs would create art for, as you can see with the image of Alexander Dumas in a 1965 edition of Figures in Negro History. The countless collaborations between the two are at once an embodiment of their belief in a multiracial educational experience and the possibilities for creating educational materials that could speak to the masses. I see this initial collaboration as one that speaks to the intra-institutional work that moved the museum mission to educate forward. It should also be noted that the museum was only able to thrive off volunteers. Whether this looked like the neighbor sprucing up the yard adjacent to the original building on Michigan Ave, or literally staffing the museum using volunteer labor, the museum was still at the whim of capitalist enterprise despite its fervent support of public education and accessibility. While these internal collaborations were critical for maintaining the museum, I see the collaboration between visitors and those running the institution as equally, if not more critical, to the longevity of the DuSable as a cornerstone for Black history and culture. A few moments I found in the archive lend itself to this logic. For me, one of the most critical findings in the archive was a 1996 letter from Dr. Burroughs to Tanya Barringer of the Mel Fisher Maritime Heritage Society in Florida. In this letter, Dr. Burroughs expresses disappointment in a show originating from Mel Fisher that would later travel to the DuSable. After seeing the show, The Wreck of Henrietta, at the Detroit African American Museum, Dr. Burroughs wrote to Barringer, and while Burroughs is concerned with numerous things about the show, there was one moment in particular that stood out to me. In reference to the point of view of the exhibition, Burroughs states, quote, "Problematic, too, is the questionable point of view permeated throughout the text, which is certain to meet with considerable resistance from our academic community, especially those associated with African studies." She continued to critique the exhibition for its oversimplification and generalization of an Africanness that they simply couldn't exhibit. I see this moment as critical for thinking through Burroughs' understanding of the surrounding community as stakeholders in the exhibitions of the DuSable. So while there may not have been a direct collaboration on this particular exhibition with the academic community surrounding the museum, their interests were under consideration as critical to successful reception. And this brings me to my final prong, which is collective and active preservation. Here, I am interested in the ways in which preservation becomes a twofold scenario. It is both the preservation of knowledge and the preservation of goods. The communal and collective acquisition of goods sits at the center of the collecting practice of the early days of the DuSable Museum. I would say the museum was equally concerned with the preservation of oral histories and knowledge as it was with material acquisitions. Multiple moments in the archive pointed to an emphasis on oral histories, a methodological approach historically deemed inconclusive and refutable under Western epistemological frameworks. Rather than support white supremacist ideals of evidence, the DuSable made this preservation of knowledge central to its programming and board organization. In 1975, the museum hosted a seminar on preserving your family history as an effort to emphasize the importance of maintaining a record of Black histories and at the same time announced a historic preservation board committee. The board also had an oral history committee. This acceptance of alternative forms of knowledge production, at least as it relates to historically empirical processes, reveals an institutional investment in knowledge preservation that also supports the practice outside of the museum and in direct partnership with the surrounding community. The second part of preservation of which I was interested in was the role of object acquisition in the onset of the museum. Throughout my readings, it became clear that acquisitions took multiple forms. Dr. Burroughs would seek out objects or return from her travels with new additions, but it was also clear how crucial it was for the community to be involved in the indexing of goods. An undated newsletter coming from the museum when it was at its original building on Michigan lists out new recent acquisitions of the museum. The list consists of objects such as letters to sculptures that had been taken in from folks directly in the community and folks from afar. In addition to this public acquisitions list, I also came across an essay titled Afro-Americana, Defining It, Finding It, Collecting It by Byron Rushing, which I'm assuming, since it was in Dr. Burroughs' possession, was of great relevance to thinking through methods of collecting, stating that collecting Black art is not just fun and games, it is part of the life and death struggle of truth through the liberation of minds. It is part of the collection of facts that serve as the database for interpretation. While this may not be in the words of Dr. Burroughs, I see this interest in collecting art and historic objects as a predicament with great stakes that Dr. Burroughs took up in her collecting and programmatic capacities. When thinking about this task, one can't help but ask, what does it mean to operate a Black institution undergirded by a society built by white supremacy? What's at stake in holding these objects and asking them to, quote, serve as the database for interpretation? While I'm still working through these questions myself, I think it's apparent that Dr. Burroughs and her collaborators knew the stakes of their work, as can best be stated by an undated flyer from the time they were in their original building calling for donations to, quote, help make Negro history live. So for me, this is just a starting point for thinking through the legacy of Dr. Burroughs as it relates to a practice of collecting and educating. Ultimately, the work of education, collaboration, and preservation overlap and act symbiotically. It's impossible to silo them from one another, but my hope is that by parsing out her varied commitments to the museum through different modes of engagement, we can slowly begin to understand how Dr. Burroughs' hopes and understanding of a museum might serve us in thinking about alternative modes of collecting and exhibiting materials, especially as it relates to Black diasporic people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you very much. That was great. We'll give the audience a few moments to see if there are any questions. Give people a chance to think. People are free to speak in, to unmute themselves or to also type their questions in the chat.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for that question. So the question in the chat was, I wonder how your exploration into the legacy and life of Margaret Burroughs has influenced or reinforced your approach to programming. Well, funny enough, I actually have not been in museum programming since starting this work, since I've been in the thick of PhD studies. But I do see some resemblance sort of in how Margaret Burroughs sort of programmatic and investment in community education programming like runs pretty heavily among Black women working in museum spaces. So I come from working at the Brooklyn Museum where I worked exclusively with a team of Black women who really wanted to be in the Brooklyn community and serving folks who perhaps spent their entire lives in Brooklyn but had never been to the Brooklyn Museum. So that really was an impetus for starting the Museum on Wheels program, which I see as really in relation to this act of bringing in objects to folks so then it removes sort of a barrier to entry to entering a museum, which holds a lot of sort of charged energy, I think, especially as you read more about and also experience how museums become policed, especially for Black bodies moving throughout museums. So while I haven't had the opportunity to implement Dr. Burroughs's sort of frameworks in my programmatic interests, I see sort of this lineage of Black cultural workers taking on that legacy as well, which I think is really cool and exciting.
I have a question related to you mentioned Black archival practice, and I was wondering if you've been able to. I know you're early in your doctoral studies. If you've been able to engage with kind of the way people in the field of archival studies have discussed Black archival practice, specifically someone like Tanya Sutherland, um,
Mhm.
who's at UCLA, who's done a lot about Black archival practice, and had like this special issue of the Black Scholar looking at the way
Mhm.
Black archival practice. And so I know within the field of archives itself, we have a lot of Black archivists thinking about who are actually engaged with the field of archives, also thinking about how Black archival practices. And I wonder if you have engaged with them, if you've seen the effects or the traces of Burroughs anywhere in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. So this quote that I had in there from Okechukwu was from that issue of the Black Scholar,
Okay.
which was co-edited by Tanya. So
Okay.
I definitely see sort of like these traces of Dr. Burroughs's legacy, and I did do like a quick like word search in all of the both of the issues of the journal, and I didn't see her listed as sort of like a figure or a reference. So I think I was also like really interested in how like Dr. Burroughs's legacy as someone who is fairly like site specific to the South Side, but also is like very much interested in like these diasporic conversations, could perhaps be the person who really like undergirds this understanding of a Black archival practice, but yet we have yet to sort of like see her work as like a focal point. But I refer back to that issue of the Black Scholar pretty much in every seminar paper I'm writing. So yeah, it's a wonderful 2 volumes that they
Yeah.
viewed.
I mean, I think Tanya Sutherland's work in general, outside of that, is very informative.
Mhm.
Even if she's not using the term Black archival practice, she's talking about the
Mhm.
relationship between Black communities and archives in really dynamic ways. Um, if there's not another question, okay, okay, Logan has a question. Let's see what Logan is saying. Um, did you come across anything surprising while looking into the life of Margaret Burroughs, or lingering questions about her archival practice that you are still sitting with since finishing this project?
Yeah. I think that there were a lot of surprising things. I think probably the most surprising for me was that letter that she had sent to the 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 Heritage like Museum in Florida. Mostly because I just loved how unapologetically she had said like this is not gonna work for our audiences, and like this is something that folks in the South Side are going to see through as like an oversimplification of sort of like this understanding of an African identity. She also goes on further in that letter talking about there's a representation of slavery that they found to just be like kind of like just like unacceptable, and like their sort of like framing and understanding of like chattel slavery in the United States. So I that was incredibly surprising. And I think like overall, as someone coming from an outside perspective, I don't think I realized like how crucial sort of like integrationist um like methodology was important to the DeSable Museum. So like throughout a lot of the educational materials, you just see references to bringing together like Polish people with Black people across Chicago, and Jewish people and Black people. So there's really like an interest in sort of like diversifying the student and like learning population of the museum. Um, that I found to be like really interesting and I didn't realize was like so pivotal in sort of like their development of educational practices.
So one of the interesting when you walk into the DeSable, one of the things you see is like the founder. So there's founders of the DeSable Museum, right? So
Mhm.
there's Margaret Burroughs, but there were other people who were kind of instrumental and who were very in their own rights very crucial to like Black Chicago history. And I was wondering if you were able to see her correspondence was with the other founders of the museum. I
Mhm.
know one of them, for instance, who stands out to me is Frederick Humar Mirab, whose papers are at Chicago State
Mhm.
University.
Okay.
Um, and just his work, and also in this kind of a parallel stream of like preserving Black history. So I was wondering if you were able to see any correspondences between herself and other founders of the museum, or can see any dynamics, or found that their lives, what was the symbiosis and what was going on between them.
Yeah. I will say, so in terms of the number of folders I was able to get through in the month compared to just like the vastness of her archive was definitely not a ton. So in terms of a ton of correspondence with other founders, I would say the most prevalent that I came across was correspondence with Eugene Feldman, and also correspondence from her husband in particular. But that could also just be because the time frame that I was primarily looking at was really in sort of like early framing. So I don't know how that might sort of like uh, build out over time, or perhaps like different correspondences might be in different sections of the archives or papers. Um, but I definitely do, at least in the correspondence and in a lot of like her letters to like state officials, it seemed as though she was talking from like a group perspective and like a we perspective, which I found to be really interesting. Even though perhaps folks may not have been directly named, I think it was very apparent just in the way that she talked about the museum that it was very much like this collaborative sort of effort, and it was not like her sole like viewing of how the museum should be or interact with the public. And I think that's also comes up in that letter that I referenced from the Florida like Heritage Museum, where it was like a group of them that had seen this exhibition and like collectively said that this was no, but she did sort of take like the front facing sort of like position as like a stakeholder with the museum. So unfortunately, I didn't come across a whole lot of other correspondence with creators of the museum. It was a lot of like Eugene Feldman and Charles Burroughs' work, at least in the folders I looked at.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our audience for Sophia? It looks as if, you've dazzled us and we're speechless. And so,
It could be
um,
the Friday of it all.
well, thank you so much, Sophia. We really appreciate it. We learned a lot, and we wish you continued success in your doctoral studies. And can't wait to get your book about this when it comes out. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you
you
all so
everyone
much, and
for spending your Friday. It's lovely.
thank you.